Welcome back to Damn Parenting. I'm Eva and I'm so glad you're here. Today we're kicking off something a little new, a monthly mini-series where we dive into big parenting topics in small, supportive episodes. Whether you're here for a quick dose of encouragement or to learn something new, we hope this series helps someone out there feel a little bit more seen, supported, and less alone. If it does, please take a moment to like, subscribe, share, and rate the podcast, as it really helps more parents find their way to get the support we all deserve. You're listening to our new monthly series, where we're going to be tackling those big topics in small, manageable episodes, and I'm so excited to introduce our new resident child psychologist, Faye from Care Psychology, who's going to be joining us every month to help us get to grips with understanding our little ones. You might remember Faye from episode 75, where we explored building resilience and a growth mindset in children. She's a parenting educator and child psychologist with a focus on emotional development in early childhood. And we're so lucky to have her back with us for this series. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most important and often overwhelming parts of parenting young children, those big emotions. You know the ones, tears over that blue cup, or the shoes that feel wrong all of a sudden, or that meltdown at the end of a really long day. So together, we're going to unpack what's really going on beneath those big reactions and how to understand how to get them to be calmer, and also for us to have a more connected parenting experience. Faye, welcome. It's so good to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I guess the first question is, what exactly do we mean when we talk about big emotions in young children?
So from my perspective, big emotions are those really big, intense emotions that we often see in our children. So things like frustration, anxiety, and sadness. So for example, when we see frustration, we might see crying, screaming, hitting, kicking, biting, throwing things or themselves onto the floor. Or with anxiety, we might see things like withdrawal, difficulty sleeping, challenges concentrating, a change in appetite, all those types of things. So for me, big emotions is kind of the big umbrella term, and then emotions, different challenging emotions kind of fit underneath that term.
And can you explain, why do our little ones feel so strongly?
Little ones feel so strongly because their brain is going through a complete restructure. Their neural connections are very much developing and their brains are very much immature. So we often consider children to have the same processes that we do in terms of how they process the world, but actually they have very immature brains that are processing different things very, very differently. Just to provide a bit of an explanation around this, when we're born, we're driven by our limbic system, which is the lower part of the brain. So it's the very primitive part of the brain. And that part of the brain is very much responsible for our survival. So it's responsible for things like making sure we're fed when we're hungry or when we're tired, or supporting us to feel safe, or like when we're feeling too hot. It very much registers those things. And also, it's a key part of supporting us through the fight, flight, or freeze response. So it very much detects any threat that we might come across. And so it's a key part of our survival to support us in making sure that, for example, in the past, in evolutionary times, we would have had daily difficulties that we would have come across, where perhaps like a saber-toothed tiger would have been a threat to us. So in that moment, the limbic part of the brain would have detected that threat and would have kicked in the fight, flight, or freeze response, which in that moment would have led us to hopefully engage in a behavior that would have been positive for our survival. So it would have helped us to survive. So in terms of the limbic system, it very much acts on impulse. Survival is the key priority, and it helps us to make split decisions that help us to survive. Fear is also detected here, and as I said before, it activates the fight, flight, or freeze response. So that's the limbic system, and that's the brainstem part of the brain. And very much when children are born, that's the part of the brain that is very dominant. And then the next part of the brain that's really helpful to know about is the amygdala, which is the emotion center of the brain. So as children become a little bit older, the emotion center of the brain very much starts to come into play. And the amygdala is in charge of emotions such as fear, anger, and joy. Now, one of the difficulties that we have is that particularly in children ages 0 to 5, this part of the brain can become very, very dominant, and it can very much take control and lives in the here and now. And it can't apply logic. Again, it's linked to survival and feeds into the fight, flight, or freeze response. And what it does is when we experience threats or when we experience difficulties for our children, this part of the brain very much dominates and takes over, Now, the other part of the brain that I think is really important for us to be aware of is the prefrontal cortex, which is the higher order thinking part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that you or I, as adults, is very dominant. And it helps us to be very logical. It helps us to make decisions. It helps us to problem solve, analyze, be flexible, and it helps us to engage in empathy. Now, the difficulty that we have with our children is that they're not able to access the prefrontal cortex the same way that you or I will. And the amygdala is often the very, very dominant part of the brain. So what then happens is, particularly when they're experiencing big emotions, it's the amygdala and the limbic system that takes control rather than the prefrontal cortex. So then it makes it really difficult for them in that moment to be able to analyze the situation, to be able to think logically, to be able to reason. And that's why often when our children are experiencing those big emotions, when you try to rationalize with them, when you try to speak to them logically, they're not hearing you because the language part of the brain switched off and they're not able to process that information. The way that children process the world is very, very different, and the way that they process information is very different because of the way that their brain is structured.
I feel like I need to label that. Here's the science bit. It's very scientific how you just explained it. And I think what you just said there is super important for everyone and anyone. Literally, they shut down when they're in that moment and they cannot process anything we're saying to them. And I think that's one of the biggest learnings I myself had as a parent, because you're just wasting your breath, but you're also building up your frustration in that moment. And then that's where you then both feed into this whole element, I guess. So understanding this has given us a new lens. Instead of thinking, why is my child being so difficult? We can actually ask, what is my child trying to tell me? It's incredible. The brain is amazing.
Absolutely. And I think when you look at things differently, you can actually see your child in a different light. So it helps you to see that actually it's the way that they're processing that information, or it's the way that they don't have control over how they're responding in that situation. Often the emotion part of the brain takes over and they completely lose control. So in that moment, the best thing we can do is connect with them and be empathetic and provide space for them to be able to process what's going on for them.
Okay, so let's have a bit of a reality check here. Let's talk about everyday examples, and then you can maybe help us understand then why the child is doing whatever they do. So, for example, a child putting on their shoes, and this is like maybe 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, or so on, putting on the shoes, and obviously they might end up getting frustrated with the zip or the Velcro or the slip-ons or something. What can we learn from that aspect from a child's perspective?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements to it. So I suppose a child experiencing difficulties putting on the shoes, one element might be difficulties with fine motor skills in terms of being able to put on the shoes initially. But I think also there's an element of thinking about the way that your child is processing that and the way that you would process it, because you've put on your shoes thousands of times, whereas for your child, they have not done that. So for us, that process of putting on your shoes is very automatic. We do it without even thinking. Whereas for a child, they have to be very intentional in everything that they do to be able to put their foot into there, whether it's fastening Velcro or whether they're a little bit older, fastening laces. They have to really put a lot of effort and time into that. And especially when they then experience difficulties, and then you might see some frustration around that, you can definitely understand why it is a little bit more difficult for them and why you might see big emotions coming out of that.
Okay. Next one. What about refusing food? I mean, we are all going through this, and that's one of my biggest pet peeves being a parent is food waste. Can you explain why they might be going through that phase?
I think with any of these, you can probably look at different hypotheses around why you might be seeing that. And if I'm completely honest, this is one I often see with my little one in terms of refusing food. And I think that there's different approaches that you could take. But I think the one that springs to my mind in particular is perhaps around a control element in terms of feeling like they're not perhaps having autonomy over certain situations, or perhaps feeling like they need a little bit more control over something. And when I talk about control, I don't mean it in the sense of them being devious. It's more about feeling a sense of autonomy over certain situations. And I understand that we're talking about really young children here, but also at the same time, I suppose there's an element where children still like to feel like they have a sense of autonomy over certain parts parts of their lives, particularly as they get older and particularly as they start to become more independent.
And then I guess another one will be one that I think everyone is going to be very highly aware of is those meltdowns when they're tired. Can you explain the emotions around that?
I think meltdowns when they're tired is a really big one. It's one we see so frequently, isn't it? And I always think about this in terms of children having a different window of tolerance. So we all have a window of tolerance around the challenges that we experience. And some days that window of tolerance can be much bigger. And some days that window of tolerance can be much smaller. And actually, when children are tired, when we're tired, often that window of tolerance is much smaller. And what we're able to cope with and deal with day to day is actually much less than on a different day when we're feeling less tired and when we've perhaps had more sleep.
I think, yeah, everyone will know this one. And speaking of which, I just used the word meltdown. Can you actually explain what's the difference between meltdown and tantrum?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it's actually really subjective based on our own interpretation. I mean, what you see as a meltdown and a tantrum might be quite different to what I see as a meltdown and a tantrum. And then somebody else might have a completely different interpretation altogether. So I think they're very socially constructed in terms of how we perceive the world and what our experiences have been. So it's probably quite a difficult one. I mean, my interpretation, would it be helpful for me to give you my interpretation?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So in terms of my interpretation of a tantrum, it would be in response to them perhaps not getting what they want or perhaps not getting boundaries. But I think it's really important to acknowledge, regardless of that, the big emotion that you're seeing is that they're communicating something. So regardless of that, there's a communication element in that situation. They might be communicating that they perhaps need a little bit more control or a little bit more autonomy over what's happening. And then for me, a meltdown would be a more significant emotional outburst and perhaps tied into extreme tiredness or maybe overstimulation or perhaps sensory needs that have perhaps triggered it.
I don't know about you, but sometimes it's like, oh, I had this meltdown, or oh, I had it like I did as an adult. Is there any age related to meltdowns and tantrums?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think traditionally we often see more kind of meltdowns and tantrums between the age of 0 and 5 because of the restructuring of the brain, and particularly because children are finding it really, really difficult to manage their emotions during that time because their brain is very much led by the emotion center of the brain. But also at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that our brains are developing right up until the age of 25. So actually, we're probably going to see those challenges at any age range, really. And I think it's also important to acknowledge as well that there's another restructuring process during the teenage years as well, where there's lots of pruning going on in the brain, where lots of information that's been learned that's no longer relevant anymore is essentially pruned out of the brain. And the restructuring starts with the lower center of the brain and then moves up towards the higher order thinking. So that's why in teenage years, you get kind of like the teenage mood, so to speak, and also the risk taking as well, because during that period of time, you see that the emotion center of the brain again becomes quite dominant until the brain is restructured and they can effectively access the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, great. We have so much fun to come in the teenage years.
Sorry
Okay.
to disappoint you there.
So it's never just about the shoes or the snack. It's a cue to look beneath the surface, then, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes there might be like a tiny trigger, but actually we need to do some detective work to really, really dig and unpick what's actually going on beneath the surface. The other day, I was thinking about this with my little boy we were on our way home from daycare and we stopped off at the park and he was just becoming completely unsettled about everything. He was getting really frustrated. He was getting really frustrated with the other children because they were playing with the things that he wanted to play with. And I knew the issue wasn't that, because usually he's great with that. So I think for me, there was a couple of elements. He was either really tired and his window of tolerance was much smaller, or it was something else. So when we got home, we had a little bit of time where we were just chilling on the sofa together and we were just having a little bit of a chat. And at this point, he was regulated. So he was in the headspace where he was able to speak to me and access some logical thinking about the situation. And I just said to him, "How's your day been today?" Has it been a little bit tricky? Have you had any points where you found things really tricky? And he just said to me, yeah, daycare's been quite tricky today. And I was like, okay, so what's been what tricky part have you had? And he just said, I just really missed you today.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, and actually, he'd had a really long day at daycare because like I'd had a really long day at work. So he'd been in quite early. And yeah, all he really wanted was just a little bit of connection time. And there was me kind of like on the way home from daycare thinking, right, let's go to the park, let's get him some proprioceptive input, get him running around. And actually, all he really wanted in that moment was just a little bit of time with me and some connection. And he needed me to give him that space to be able to articulate himself, to say, actually, yeah, I've just found things a little bit tricky today. And then me to receive that and be like, that's okay.
I guess we're coming towards the end of it. We're going to put you on the spot, really, I guess, right now. Now we know the what they are and the why they are. Now let's really get into why people are going to be listening to this. How do we manage these situations? Can you give us any supportive strategies or tools for us as parents to be able to manage our little ones? And as you said, this is from 0 to 5 and maybe above.
I think something to acknowledge before we start this conversation is it's a huge process. So when we are supporting our children and their big emotions, it is a huge, huge process that occurs over time. There's not any easy fixes. There are sometimes strategies that we can use and they might work quite effectively. And if they do work effectively, keep doing more of it. If something's working, do more of it. If it's not working, try something different. But I think one of the key messages that I would recommend is, I suppose, you are the best tool in this situation. And providing co-regulation and attunement is what's most important. So when our children are experiencing big emotions, sitting with them in those messy situations, in those uncomfortable feelings, is one of the most important things that we can do. I think as parents, we don't want to see our children feeling uncomfortable. We don't want to see our children distressed. So we always want to jump to a solution and we always want to fix it. But actually, one of the keys to supporting our children to be emotionally resilient and to develop their emotional awareness is by supporting them to process those emotions, understand those emotions, and then develop independent regulation strategies to be able to deal with those big emotions in the future. I think it's important to note as well that what works for one child doesn't work for another child. So I can talk about a couple of strategies here, but I guess it's trial and error in terms of thinking about what works for your child. And one thing I would always say to a parent is, you know your child better than anybody else. And knowing your child, you'll be able to figure out what works best for them based on information that's shared. One of the key things really is sitting with your child during these moments and thinking about what are the things that really work. So for my child, big hugs are important for him. Like when he's emotionally dysregulated, he's like a koala. So he just needs big hugs, like proprioceptive input where he's like hugged nice and tight and snug. And that for him, you can almost feel his body just releasing in that moment because he just needs that connection and that hug. But then I know when I've talked to parents in my workshop sessions and they've said, gosh, the last thing my child wants is a hug. Actually, they just need my presence and they just need me to sit with them in that moment and to know that I'm here to help and I'm here to support you with working through this emotion. But your presence is the most important thing in that situation. Sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of a framework to work towards in terms of thinking about managing big emotions. And I suppose when you are faced with a big emotion, sometimes it can be really difficult to know how to respond. And sometimes you can be taken aback. And we're all human. We're often triggered as well by big emotions. So when your child is hitting out really angry and frustrated, sometimes our instinct can be stop and to speak to them in quite a cross way to try and stop that emotion, particularly if that anger is directed towards you. But actually, one of the best things you can do is connect with them first. And even though I will say I do not always get this right, it's not always as straightforward as it perhaps seems. And in the moment, it can be really, really difficult to regulate yourself. But as best you can, one of the models that I really like is called Stop Snot. And it's shared in a book called There's No Such Thing as Naughty by Kate Silverton. And she says, whenever faced with a big emotion with your child, the best thing you can do is just stop and take a breath. When you are really in the thick of it, just stop and take a breath and pause. You don't have to necessarily do anything. You're present with your child, and then really consider it's not personal. In that situation, even though it might feel like it's very, very personal, and it might feel like the child is acting out in a way to annoy you or upset you, but actually it's not personal at all. And it's probably something completely unrelated. And ultimately, they're not being naughty, manipulative, or stubborn. There's a reason why they're behaving for it, and taking a step back and knowing that it's not personal to you is actually really important. And then she suggests observing. So just observe what is going on. So it's about being that detective and really thinking about what is going on in this moment. What is it that's triggering? Is it the environment? Is there too much going on? Is it too noisy? Is it too busy? Also thinking about, right, okay, are they tired? Are they hungry? Like all those basic things. Do they need a little bit of sensory input, for example, in some sort of area? Is there something that they're lacking? Is it the fact that something's happened in the day that they're now processing and you're now seeing a big emotion? But being that detective in that moment and really observing and taking a step back can help you to then move forward. And then the last one is turn it around. So think about the situation from another perspective. So think about the situation from the perspective of your child. Rather than thinking they're being naughty, they're being disrespectful, actually think about it from the perspective of the child in terms of what's actually going on for them right now. So I can see you're finding it really difficult. I wonder whether it's this that you're finding really, really tricky. So using those kind of statements helps to show your child that you've actually acknowledged what's going on. You've acknowledged that they're experiencing a big emotion, and you've acknowledged that you know that something's not quite right, and you want to try and help them to move forward is a really big step in the right direction. And the more that we do this, the more that we connect, the more that we pause, the more that we observe, and the more that we send that message to our child that we are there to help, hopefully, the more that'll build their brain in a positive direction in terms of supporting them to then manage those emotions for themselves independently in the future.
So we're going to be highlighting that stop snot now in the show notes, just so that everyone can really break this one down, because it's quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And another thing I've come across as well that might be really helpful for me to mention is Name It to Tame It by Dan Siegel. And he suggests that the more that we label emotions and the more that we talk about emotions, it can have numerous benefits. So one of the benefits is we're developing their emotional awareness, we're developing the emotional vocabulary that children can use to express themselves. So you often see that children find it really difficult to have the words to be able to explain how they're feeling. So the more we model those, the more we are supporting them to really express themselves in that moment. So using statements like, oh, I can see you're feeling a little bit frustrated helps to support them in the future in terms of thinking about, oh, actually, that feeling that I had is frustration. So to be able to kind of provide them with the tools to label how they're feeling in the future, and then to be able to share that in the future with others. But also there's an element of acknowledging the emotion and acceptance of the emotion, providing validation of it's okay for you to feel this emotion. And I think that's a huge one in itself, because often when children feel big emotions, they feel shame linked to those big emotions. So particularly when children are engaging in behaviors that might hurt other people, so kicking, biting, hitting, often naturally they feel shame from it. And we might not outwardly see that, but particularly when we're dealing with children that are particularly sensitive children, they naturally feel shame inwardly. And if we kind of work with them to accept it's okay to feel those big emotions, like ideally you might not want them to engage in those behaviors, but ultimately accepting that yes, it's okay to feel angry, it's okay to feel frustrated, and the normal emotions that everyone feels is a really, really important message to send your child.
This is quite a lot already. Are there any books that you could suggest as well, specifically around emotions and helping us understand them a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think just storybooks are always really lovely to use with children, just to help them to understand their world and to understand their feelings. And I suppose the premise behind this is that they help children to understand that they're not alone in those emotions. So when we hear about stories of other people and we can relate to them and we can think, oh, actually, I felt like that. And particularly, I love stories that help us to see that there's ways forward as well. So a really lovely book is The Huge Bag of Worries by Virginia Ironside, which talks about someone who has a big worry and it's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, but then they speak to someone and suddenly that bag just becomes so much smaller and their worries seem much more manageable. I think stories like that can be really lovely, and they have a great message in terms of supporting children to think about when they experience that emotion, what they can then do about it in moving forward. Another really lovely one, and I suppose going on the theme of connection, another really lovely one is The Invisible String by Patrice Karst. And this one is about how we have a string that attaches you to your child, and how it's an invisible string that stretches as long as it possibly can, but that string is always there connecting you. And I suppose when your child is going to daycare or when your child is going to school and they have prolonged periods of time away from you, like talking about that invisible string still connecting you is really powerful in supporting that connection. And when I was working in schools, one of the things that was suggested was sometimes like pretending that the string is attached to your finger and then just wiggling your finger every now and again to remind your child that that string is still there is really lovely. And again, it supports that connection between the two of you and reinforces the fact that you're always connected by the string. So something like that, I think, is really lovely. Other books that I've come across, there's two by Rachel Bright. So there's the Worrysaurus and the Stompysaurus. So the Worrysaurus looks at supporting worries, and the Stompysaurus looks at supporting frustration. But again, really, really child-friendly books, supporting children in understanding their emotions. And particularly if they like dinosaurs, that book could really appeal to them.
I love it. Okay, well, Faye, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing such warmth and clarity to this big, very important topic. Here's what I hope we as listeners will be taking away from this episode. Kids feel big because their brains are still learning how to regulate, and our calm presence, even when we really don't feel it and we don't have the answers, is more powerful than any quick fix. So when we're naming the emotions, we can validate that our child is going through something and offer the safe ways to express those feelings and help build their emotional resilience for life. God knows, even as adults, we need this support as well. This work isn't easy, but it is meaningful, and you don't have to do it perfectly. You just have to stay present, curious, and remind yourself you're learning together. If today's conversation resonated with you, we'd love you to take a moment to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast, and maybe even share it with your partner, friend, or fellow parent who could use a little extra support right now. These small actions help more families find these thoughtful, judgment-free conversations. And Faye's here every month to talk us through each step. And of course, all the resources we mentioned are linked in the show notes. So until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, your child isn't giving you a hard time. They're having the hard time. And you, well, you're doing more than you think. Until next time.